The exam room turned into a comedy show the second Milo opened his mouth. On a quiet mountain morning, veterinarian Laura Bennett heard a strange sound drifting through the trees, a voice unlike anything she'd ever encountered. She had no idea it belonged to a scrappy little bobcat who had survived against all odds, and who could sweet-talk in ways that would send the entire internet into laughter. The moment he spoke, everything changed. The Blue Ridge Mountains had a way of holding the quiet, letting it sit heavy and peaceful over the pine-lined slopes each dawn. Most mornings, Dr. Laura Bennett woke to nothing more than the slow drip of last night's rain sliding from the eaves of her little cabin. It was the kind of stillness she had traded an entire city for, a quiet that felt earned after 2 decades of emergency veterinary work in Boston. But on this particular morning, the quiet didn't hold. Something broke it. Something soft, high, and strangely deliberate. Laura had been standing at her kitchen counter, stirring honey into a mug of tea, when the sound slipped through the open window. A note, bright and sharp, cutting through the misty air like a pebble tossed into a still pond. She froze. It wasn't birdsong. It wasn't the rasp of a fox. It wasn't any wild call she knew, and she knew most of them by heart. The sound came again, longer this time, rising at the end as though waiting for someone to answer, for her to answer. She set her mug down and stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door whisper shut behind her. The mountains were wrapped in a low, pale fog, drifting through the trees in slow ribbons. She listened. At first, all she heard was the soft pluck of dew falling from pine needles. Then, there it was again. A curious, lilting trill that felt oddly directed, almost conversational. Laura frowned, leaning forward slightly, trying to place the direction. The sound drifted from somewhere beyond the tree line, just far enough to blur into the morning haze. "Hello!" she called out before catching herself. She felt ridiculous, talking into the fog like someone expecting a reply. But the reply came anyway. A shorter note this time, sharp and bright, as if acknowledging her voice. She stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the soft earth. The air smelled of wet bark and cold stone, the sense of a forest that wasn't quite awake yet. As she walked, the sound grew clearer, not frantic, not distressed. More like a beckoning. There was a haunting gentleness to it, the way it rose and curled in the air, like a question she didn't yet understand. She followed it deeper into the fog, passing the split-rail fence that marked the edge of her property. Her years in wildlife work had taught her caution, but this sound nudged her forward, tugging at her curiosity. Every few steps it rang out again, shifting just slightly in tone, almost like it reacted to the rhythm of her footsteps. She paused and so did the sound. She moved again, and it followed. A strange, unspoken call and response. "That's not a fox, not an owl, not a—" She cut herself off as the note drifted through the air once more, softening at the edges. She felt the hairs on her arms rise. Whatever it wasn't random. It had intention. She pushed aside a wet branch and stepped into a small clearing where the fog pooled low along the ground. For a moment, she heard nothing, just the hush of the woods holding their breath. Then the sound came again, but this time it was different. Closer, warmer, almost melodic. A sound far too sweet, too gentle, to belong to any predator she knew. Yet it carried the unmistakable timbre of something wild. Her heartbeat quickened in her chest. It felt as though the forest was speaking to her in a language just shy of familiar. She took another step, and another, drawn forward by something she couldn't quite explain. The voice, if she could call it that, seemed to watch her, circling her with sound she couldn't see the source of. Then, Just as she reached the far edge of the clearing, the fog shifted with a faint breeze. Something moved behind it. Not a shape, just the faintest tremble of motion, retreating deeper into the pale light. And with it came one last note, soft, rising, almost teasing, a sound that didn't belong to any creature she'd ever treated or studied. Laura exhaled slowly, her breath mingling with the mist. "What on earth are you?" she whispered. The forest didn't answer this time. It didn't need to. Whatever had called to her wasn't done yet, and despite the chill settling down her spine, she felt an unexpected spark of anticipation. Something out there wanted her attention, and had found a very unusual way to ask for it. As she turned back toward the cabin, the sound echoed once more through the trees, higher and sweeter than before. A voice that didn't belong to any wild animal she'd ever encountered. A voice that felt strangely like the beginning of a conversation. And Laura Bennett had no idea yet just how much that conversation was about to change her life. The fog had begun to thin by the time she stepped out of the clearing. Shapes sharpened, colors returned. A faint hum of an engine rolled through the morning hush, so out of place, so sudden, that Laura stopped mid-stride. No one ever drove out here this early. No one ever drove out here unless they had a reason. She followed the low rumble until the faint outline of a white Forest Service SUV came into view, parked crookedly beside the tree line near her cabin. The driver's door was open, and a familiar figure stepped out, brushing pine needles from his uniform. "Kyle?" she called, confused. Ranger Kyle Maddox straightened up, tall and tired-looking, with the kind of face that made people trust him on instinct. He tipped his hat when he spotted her, but the gesture lacked its usual easy confidence. His hand was resting on the back hatch of the SUV, and beneath his palm, something inside shifted. The metal cage in the trunk rattled softly. "I was hoping you'd be awake," Kyle said. I've got something I'm not entirely sure how to explain." Laura walked closer, and the first thing she noticed was how tense Kyle's shoulders were. The second thing was the thin, wavering sound rising from the open hatch, a sound she recognized instantly. It was the same strange little trill she'd heard in the woods, only clearer now, more directed. She stopped beside him and stared into the back of the SUV. A small wire crate sat there, old enough to show rust along the hinges. One side was dented inward, as if someone had kicked it. And inside, pressed tight into the farthest corner, was a bobcat kitten, thin, bedraggled, with ears too big for his face and eyes that gleamed like polished amber. But the most striking thing was the way the little creature looked at her, head tilted, as if studying her the same way she studied him. Then he let out a sound so bright and quick that it startled her, a chirping little woo-woo chirp that rose like a greeting. Laura blinked. Did he just say hello?" Kyle exhaled sharply. "Yeah, he's been doing that since sunrise. And before you ask, no, I didn't teach him that." The bobcat kitten shifted again, stepping forward with a scrappy sort of confidence that didn't fit his underfed frame. His fur stuck out in odd angles, thin in places where it should have been thick. But his posture, bold, almost sassy, made it clear that fear was the last thing on his mind. He let out another chirpy roll of sound, softer this time, but still full of intent. Laura crouched beside the crate, looking carefully at the kitten's posture. "Where did you find him?" Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. "Call came in late last night. Some hikers saw broken windows at that old rental house off Oak Hollow Road, the one those kids were using for their videos last year." He let out a long, frustrated sigh. Place was empty, lights off. Nobody around except this little guy, locked in a laundry room with a tipped-over bowl of stale cereal. Cereal, not meat, not water. Laura felt her stomach twist. "Was he injured?" she asked quietly. No visible wounds, Kyle said. But he's skin and bones. Didn't hiss. Didn't swipe. Just walked right up to me and made this. Kyle waved a hand vaguely at the crate. This talking sound. I've heard bobcats make all kinds of noises, but nothing like that. The kitten seemed to take offense at being talked around instead of talked to. He stood, tail flicking, and produced a sharp woo that sounded suspiciously like an opinion. Then he pressed one paw to the bars, tapping them once, as if demanding attention. Laura couldn't help the small laugh that slipped out. Well, he's certainly got personality. You're telling me, Kyle muttered. He's been arguing with me for 20 minutes. She moved closer, examining the kitten's eyes, the shape of his ribs beneath the patchy fur. Underweight, definitely dehydrated, but alert, much too alert, and much too willing to interact with people. You're bringing him to me because you think he was raised by someone, Laura said softly. Kyle nodded. Looks that way, or at least handled too much. No fear of humans, no hesitation, just attitude. The little bobcat chirped again, louder this time, as if to punctuate his introduction. Laura watched him, and for a moment, she felt that strange sensation again, the same one she'd felt in the fog, as though he were speaking to her. Not in words, not in anything human, but in intention. What's his name? She asked. Kyle shrugged. He didn't come with one. But I promise you, he sure acts like he has one. The kitten let out a short, rolling trill, almost proud-sounding. Laura smiled despite herself. Well, until we figure out more, I suppose we'll call you something. Something fitting. She paused. The kitten blinked at her with a boldness that didn't match his fragile frame. Milo, she said finally. The little bobcat's ears twitched. He made a sound, a soft, approving chirp, that landed so perfectly timed it made Kyle stare. You've got to be kidding me, Kyle muttered. He responded to that. Laura stood, resting a steadying hand on the crate. Let's get him inside. He needs fluids, food, warmth, and a quiet place to decompress. Tell that to him, Kyle said, stepping back as Milo chirped again, louder, as if announcing his arrival to the whole forest. As Laura lifted the crate, Milo pressed both paws to the bars, staring up at her with bright, audacious eyes. The morning fog drifted behind them, thinning into pale blue as the sun began its slow climb over the mountains. And Laura felt that same flicker of something she couldn't quite name, unease mixed with anticipation. Whatever had called to her in the woods wasn't finished yet, and now it had a name. Milo. A name that seemed to settle into the morning air like it had always belonged to him. Laura carried the crate toward the cabin, the metal cool against her palms, while the small creature inside shifted with a kind of eager impatience. Every few steps, he let out a soft chirp or a curious trill, sounds that felt too purposeful, too responsive for an animal in his condition. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the wood stove wrapped around them. Laura set the crate gently on the floor near the exam table. Milo immediately pushed forward, pressing his nose through the bars and surveying the room with the boldness of a creature who had no idea how fragile he truly was. His eyes traveled from the counter to the shelves to her face, each glance quick and sharp, like he was cataloging the entire space. Kyle closed the door behind them with a low sigh. Before you get too attached, you should hear what else we found. Laura straightened, her attention still fixed on the bobcat. I figured there was more. Kyle took off his hat and placed it on the table, a gesture that always meant bad news. We went back to the house after taking him out. Had to check for more animals. The place was torn up, garbage, old camera equipment, broken glass everywhere. He paused, jaw tightening. We found paw prints, Smaller ones, but no animals. They must have gotten out or... He didn't finish the thought. Laura felt a subtle ache rise in her chest. So he wasn't alone. No, Kyle said softly. But he's the only one we found. The neighbors said a group of older teens had been squatting there off and on for months, making those videos. The ones where they think it's funny to mess with wild animals. He shook his head in quiet frustration. When the kids got scared the sheriff was looking into the break-ins, they scattered. Looks like they left in a hurry. And left him behind, Laura murmured, looking down at the thin little bobcat, who seemed to have no understanding of how close he'd come to starving. He let out another soft sound, higher this time, almost a question, as if he understood the shift in mood. Milo pawed gently at the crate bars, a tiny, insistent tap, his eyes locked onto hers, and then another chirp, a little softer, almost encouraging. He's talking again, Kyle whispered, baffled. It's not talking, Laura said, though her voice wasn't entirely convinced. It's communication, intentional communication. Kyle snorted. That's talking in my book. Laura opened the crate slowly, easing the door wide enough for Milo to decide whether he wanted to come out or not. Instantly, the kitten stepped forward. No hesitation, no fear, and padded onto the exam table with a little hop. His tail flicked high in a proud little arc, a stance far too confident for a creature so underfed. You see that? Kyle said. A wild bobcat shouldn't walk up to people like that, shouldn't be this comfortable. I know, Laura said quietly. Her fingers brushed Milo's side as she checked his ribs. 4, maybe 5 months old, underweight, muscles underdeveloped, fur patchy from malnutrition or stress, and yet, he stood there like he owned the place. Milo leaned toward her hand again, letting out a low, gurgling noise she hadn't heard before. It wasn't a purr, not exactly, but it vibrated in the air with a gentle warmth that felt far too intentional. I swear, Kyle said. He's flirting. Laura shot him a look. He's imprinting. On you? Kyle raised his brows. On humans, she corrected, though she could feel Milo pressing just a bit closer to her fingers. He's learned to associate people with food, attention, maybe survival. It's not affection in the way we think of it. Milo chirped as if disagreeing. See? Kyle muttered. He heard you. Laura continued her exam, cataloging every detail. Milo tolerated it all, ear checks, paw stretches, mouth inspection, responding not with fear but with commentary. Every action had a sound, every pause had a trill or a chirp or a questioning little meep. It was as though he couldn't stand the silence. He's got opinions, she murmured. He's got a whole vocabulary, Kyle replied. When she finished, Laura stepped back and exhaled. He needs hydration, protein, and rest, but he's resilient. He survived because he's stubborn, tenacious. And mouthy, Kyle added. Milo chirped sharply, as if offended. Then came the moment that made Laura pause completely. She leaned down to pick up a bowl of water from the floor, and as she did, her expression turned somber, thinking about the other missing kittens, about the cruelty that left this one behind. Milo watched her face shift, watched her shoulders fall slightly, and without warning, he let out a slow, rising trill, soft as a sigh, warm as a reassurance. A sound that landed in the quiet room, like a hand placed gently on her arm. Laura blinked, stunned. Did you hear that? Kyle nodded slowly. Yeah, I think he's checking on you. The idea was ridiculous, impossible, and yet the way Milo held her gaze said otherwise. It wasn't fear. It wasn't desperation. It was curiosity. Presence, something close to recognition. Laura straightened again, studying him in a new light. "He's not just surviving," she said quietly. "He's connecting." Milo trilled again, as if confirming her words. In that moment, the truth settled over her with a weight she wasn't ready for. This wasn't just a rescue case. This wasn't just a malnourished bobcat. This was a creature shaped by human hands, abandoned, confused, stripped of the instincts that should have protected him. A creature who had learned to speak the only way he knew how, through sound, tone, timing. A creature who saw her not as a threat, but as someone he expected to understand him. Laura swallowed hard. "He's the last one," she whispered. "The last survivor." Kyle nodded. "And he chose you." Milo chirped again, bright, confident, almost proud, and pressed one tiny paw against her wrist. Whatever had happened to him in that abandoned house, whatever he had endured, he wasn't afraid of the world. He was ready to argue with it, ready to talk back to it, ready to be heard. And in that moment, Laura realized something else, something that wrapped around her like the fog outside her window. For better or worse, Milo wasn't done speaking, and she was the one who needed to listen. Laura lifted him gently from the crate and set him on the padded exam table, half expecting him to shrink into the corner or bolt for safety. Instead, Milo strutted forward like a tiny monarch surveying his new kingdom. His paws made soft tapping sounds against the stainless steel, while his tail flicked back and forth with a confidence that didn't fit his size or situation. "All right, little man," Laura murmured, reaching for her stethoscope. "Let's have a look at you." Milo answered with a quick chirp, short, bright, and startlingly close to impatience. Kyle laughed under his breath. "He's got opinions about this whole process." "No kidding," Laura muttered, placing the diaphragm of the stethoscope against Milo's chest. The moment the cold metal touched his fur, Milo made a low, wobbling sound, something between a bubbling trill and a complaint, that rose in pitch like a winding siren. He wasn't afraid. Not at all. He was commenting, offering feedback, and loudly. "Is he talking back?" Kyle asked. "He's expressing himself," Laura said, trying to keep a straight face. She moved the stethoscope slightly. Milo responded instantly with a new noise, a quick woo that bounced off the cabin walls. She shifted to the opposite side of his ribcage, and he produced a soft, grumbly rumble that almost sounded like he was scolding her for taking too long. "He's got a whole soundtrack," Kyle whispered. "It's like working on a toddler who thinks he's the supervisor," Laura said. She reached up to open a cabinet for her thermometer, and the moment the hinge creaked, Milo let out another chirp. Sharp, demanding, almost offended. Laura blinked. "Was that for the cabinet?" Milo repeated the chirp, this time flicking his tail toward the door, as though admonishing her for keeping him waiting. "Oh my word," Kyle muttered. "He's backseat directing the exam." Laura grabbed the thermometer and turned back just in time for Milo to sit upright, squarely in the center of the table, his ears forward, his gaze unwavering. He looked like he was preparing to deliver a speech. "Don't do it," she warned gently, though she had no idea what "it" meant. Milo did it anyway. He let out a long, rolling trill that rose and fell in 3 distinct parts, almost musical. It sounded suspiciously like someone warming up their voice before an audition. Kyle slapped a hand over his mouth to keep from laughing. "Laura, he's rehearsing." "No," she said, trying to sound firm. "He's communicating discomfort." Milo meeped a tiny that absolutely sounded like disagreement. "Now he's arguing," Kyle said. "He's not arguing," Laura insisted. Milo answered with a very sharp, very pointed "murp" that landed like a verbal jab. Kyle burst out, laughing. "Okay, fine. He's arguing." "You're not helping," Laura said through a smile she couldn't quite suppress. She continued the exam, working through muscle tone, joint mobility, hydration levels. Milo offered commentary the entire time. Short chirps for her left hand, long trills for her right, gurgles whenever she touched his paws, and tiny squeaks when she checked his ears. Every sound was different, as if he had assigned a specific noise to each step of the process. Halfway through, the door swung open, and Sophia, Laura's young intern, stepped inside carrying a clipboard. "Good morning! Oh!" she gasped when Milo spun toward her, ears perked and eyes wide. He let out an enthusiastic woo woo woo, like a child greeting a long-lost friend. Sophia pressed her hand to her chest. "Did he just say hi?" "Don't encourage him," Laura said. Milo chirped again, louder this time, as if personally offended by her tone. "What is happening?" Sophia whispered, stepping closer. "Your guess is as good as mine," Kyle said. "He's been narrating the entire exam." Sophia leaned over the table, eyes wide with fascination. "Do you think he's imitating humans? Because that almost sounds like he's trying to talk." Milo turned his head between them, then let out a rapid series of chirps, chip, chip, chirr, as if confirming her suspicion. Laura took a breath, trying to regain control of the room, and the bobcat. "Let's take this seriously. He's vocal, yes, but it's all instinct. Borrowed behaviors, learned responses. He's not actually—" Before she could finish, Milo gently tapped her hand with one paw and delivered a soft, drawn-out trill-loo that sounded uncannily like a sympathetic sigh. Laura stared at him. Kyle whispered, "Tell me that wasn't emotional support." Sophia covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with quiet laughter. "It wasn't," Laura said, flustered. "It was just coincidental." Milo squinted at her, lifted one paw, and placed it dramatically against his chest while delivering a tiny, pitiful-sounding meep. Kyle folded his arms. "He just told you he's hurt by that." "No, he didn't," Laura insisted. Milo repeated the meep, this time adding a soft, wounded trill at the end. Sophia whispered, "Laura, he's being dramatic." Laura rubbed her forehead. "Clearly." She picked up a small jar of salve for a patch of irritated skin along Milo's flank. He watched her unscrew the lid with laser focus. When she dipped her fingers inside, he let out a series of tiny, fast, tut-tut-tut noises that sounded suspiciously like disapproval. When she touched the salve to his skin, he yelped, not in pain, but in pure theatrical outrage, and rolled onto his back, paws in the air, delivering a full-bodied wah chirp. "He's putting on a show," Kyle said. "He's always putting on a show," Sophia corrected. Laura stepped back, hands on her hips. "You're making this very difficult, little man." Milo rolled upright, shook himself, and let out a soft, gurgling rumble that was unmistakably smug. Despite everything, the noise, the antics, the exaggerated reactions, Laura felt something shift inside her. She watched the small bobcat sitting there on the exam table, tail curled neatly, eyes bright, and she realized she was no longer looking at just a patient. She was looking at an individual, a personality, a creature who had survived something he shouldn't have, who had come out of it not broken, but expressive, loudly expressive. And underneath all the sound and sass, she saw vulnerability too, a need to be seen, a need to be heard, a need for someone to understand the language he'd built for himself. "All right," she said softly. "Let's finish this." Milo answered with a quiet trill, gentle this time, soft around the edges, as if giving her permission to continue. And Laura understood, more clearly than before. This wasn't a typical rescue. This was a conversation. And Milo was determined to have the last word. By the time Laura finished his initial exam and stepped back to wash her hands, Milo had already arranged himself in the center of the table like a comedian wrapping up his set, chin lifted, paws tucked neatly under him, tail curled with deliberate elegance. Kyle and Sophia lingered nearby, both wearing the same expression, half amusement, half disbelief. Milo had delivered more commentary in 20 minutes than most house cats did in a lifetime. But as Laura reached for a clean towel and glanced up at him again, the humor softened into something heavier. Milo was small, too small. His ribcage showed faintly with every breath. The thin patches on his coat weren't just stress, they were deprivation. And beneath the bold, sassy facade, she noticed the slightest tremble in his back legs when he shifted his weight. He chirped at her when he caught her staring. A short, bright note as if to say, "Don't feel sorry for me." Laura drew in a slow breath. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, buddy?" Milo tilted his head, studying her face with unsettling depth, then made a tiny mmm, a softer sound, something close to acknowledgement. Kyle stepped closer to the table. "What's your read on him, Doc?" Laura wiped her hands and leaned both palms on the exam table, taking a moment before answering. "He's young, underweight, dehydrated, but alert. Too alert, and he's not behaving like a wild bobcat at all." She paused. "That's both good news and bad news." Sophia's eyebrows lifted. "Bad how?" "He's imprinted," Laura said quietly. "Deeply." Kyle frowned. "Meaning he was raised by someone?" "Handled too much," she replied. "Fed by hand, socialized the wrong way, exposed to voices, tone, rhythm. He doesn't recognize humans as something to fear. He recognizes them as his environment." Milo let out a tiny pew-like squeak at the word fear, then flipped onto his back, exposing his belly in the most un-bobcat-like display imaginable. His paws curled inward, his ears relaxed. He looked impossibly like a kitten asking for reassurance. Sophia's heart practically melted onto the floor. "Oh my goodness, he's showing trust." Kyle shook his head. "He's showing he doesn't know any better." Laura moved closer and gently touched Milo's flank. "Wild bobcats don't act like this," she said softly. "A healthy fear of people is what keeps them alive. If he doesn't have it, he can't survive out there." The room quieted. The wood stove crackled. Outside, wind brushed against the cabin siding in slow, rhythmic laps. Inside, the reality settled in thick and heavy. Milo flipped upright suddenly, as if sensing the shift. He studied Laura's face again, then reached forward with one paw and tapped her wrist. Immediately after, he released a soft, worried-sounding "Roo," a sound layered with concern. Soft laughter bubbled from Sophia's throat. "He's checking on you." "No," Laura tried to correct, but her voice was gentler now, almost tender. "He's reacting to tone." But Milo disagreed, loudly. The little bobcat sat up straight and made a drawn-out noise that trailed off at the end like a question, then repeated it, slower, eyes locked on hers. There was an uncanny intelligence in the way he modulated the sound, like he was trying to match her sadness with something of his own. "He's comforting you," Kyle whispered. "Threadbare fur, hungry as sin, and he's trying to comfort you." Laura swallowed. "It's just learned behavior." Milo let out a firm chirp and tapped her wrist again, harder, as if arguing the point. Sophia covered her mouth to hide a grin. "Laura, he talks back when he disagrees." "I've noticed." But Laura couldn't bring herself to smile this time. Because beneath the amusement, beneath the absurdity, there was truth. The kind that crept into your chest slowly, like a cold draft sliding under a door. "Imprinting can't be undone easily," she murmured. "Not at his age, not after what he's been through." She looked at Milo again. "He doesn't understand he's a wild animal." Milo blinked slowly, then inched closer, pressing the side of his face against her arm with unexpected gentleness. A soft trill rose from his throat, warmer than any sound he'd made so far. Sophia actually gasped. "He's snuggling," she whispered. Kyle exhaled. "That's not good, is it?" Laura ran a hand down Milo's back, feeling the roughness of his underfed spine. "It means releasing him could get him killed. He'd go to the nearest porch, the nearest camper, the nearest open door, thinking someone would feed him, thinking people are safe." Her voice tightened. "Not every person is safe." Milo's next sound was small, barely audible, something like a question wrapped in worry. His ears flattened just slightly, as if sensing the gravity in her voice. He stepped closer again, and Laura felt the tiny weight of him against her forearm. So trusting, so unaware. "This is why it's bad news," she continued. "He'll need long-term care, maybe permanent care. He's not a candidate for release." Silence settled, heavy, real. Then Milo, perhaps sensing the room needed rescuing, produced a sudden sharp burp, followed by a tiny sneeze that startled him so much he tumbled backward off his haunches. He scrambled upright, shook off the embarrassment, and chirped indignantly at the sneeze, as if the sneeze had betrayed him personally. Kyle burst into laughter. "He just scolded his own sneeze." Sophia doubled over. "Oh, he's ridiculous." Laura couldn't help it. She laughed too. A quiet laugh, softened by something warm. Milo, apparently satisfied that he'd restored the room's emotional balance, strutted back to the center of the table and posed as if awaiting applause. But Laura's thoughts didn't drift far. Beneath the comedy lay something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. Milo wasn't acting this way because he was tame. He was acting this way because he had been forced to adapt, because someone, somewhere, had shaped him into a creature caught between two worlds, wild in body, but confused in soul. She looked at him again, this chatty, dramatic, fearless little survivor, and felt the sharpest edge of the truth press into her heart. He had lost something precious, the instinct that would have protected him, and now it was up to her to protect him instead. Milo let out one final merp, gentle, questioning, as if asking whether the exam was over. Laura reached out and touched the top of his head. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. "I promise." He answered with a soft trill, not a complaint, not an argument, just trust. And for the first time since Kyle had arrived with that dented crate, the weight of responsibility settled fully into her chest. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a commitment she hadn't expected to make, and one Milo had already decided for her. Over the next few days, Milo settled into the recovery room with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged there. Not once did he show the nervous pacing, flattened ears, or silent tension most rescued bobcats displayed. Instead, he behaved like a tiny foreman overseeing a construction site, supervising every move Laura made as though he had appointed himself her personal supervisor. On the morning of the 4th day, Laura walked into the clinic carrying a small tray of minced meat and a fresh bowl of water. Before she'd even set the tray down, Milo chirped out a rapid sequence of tiny chip, chip, chip noises from inside his enclosure. Not random, not startled. They came in perfect rhythm with her footsteps, like he was announcing her arrival. "You hear that?" Sophia whispered behind her. "He's got like a greeting noise." "It's anticipation," Laura said, trying to sound clinical. "A response to routine." Milo, apparently offended by her interpretation, let out a long, delicate trill that rose at the end like a question. It sounded suspiciously like, "Really? That's all you think this is?" Kyle, who had dropped by with a delivery of extra bedding, leaned against the doorway. "That sounded like he disagreed with you." "He disagrees with everything," Laura replied. But even as she said it, she felt something tug beneath her ribs. Milo wasn't just making noise. He was placing sounds with intention, specific notes for specific situations, and the more she listened, the more obvious it became. Later that afternoon, she began writing them down in the margins of his medical chart. Short chirp, food expectation. Long trill, attention request. Gurgle purr, playfulness. Soft hum, calm or reassurance, rapid chips, alert, excited. Sharp, complaint or protest. It was a ridiculous list, one that would make most wildlife professionals smile politely and quietly dismiss. But Laura couldn't ignore the consistency. Milo matched tone with context, the way a child learning to speak might mimic expression long before real language formed. It wasn't human speech, of course. It was something else entirely. A wild patchwork of instinct, mimicry, and emotional reflex. That evening, while cleaning the room, Laura dropped a roll of gauze by accident. It hit the floor with a soft thud, and Milo immediately produced a quick yip. Not fear, not warning, but a tone identical to the sound she made when she accidentally bumped her knee against the exam table the day before. She froze. "Did he just imitate you?" Sophia gasped. "No," Laura said firmly. Milo repeated the noise. Louder. Kyle raised his hands. "Doc, he's doing impressions now." "He is not," Laura insisted. Milo looked straight at her, squinted, and repeated the calzone. Exact same pitch again, this time adding a little trill at the end for dramatic flair. Laura stared. "Okay, maybe he is." From that moment on, she listened more closely. Not as a veterinarian monitoring an animal, but as someone decoding a puzzle piece by piece. And Milo seemed to sense it. With each passing hour, his sounds became more deliberate, more tailored. When she left the room, he made a soft, drawn-out hum that lingered until she returned. When she carried enrichment toys past the enclosure, he gurgled in excitement, tiny paws reaching through the bars like he could pull the moment closer. But the most striking shift happened late one afternoon as she reviewed medical records at her desk. The winter sunlight had thinned into a pale amber glow, casting long shadows on the clinic floor. Milo lay curled in the corner of his enclosure, half asleep, the steady rise and fall of his breath almost hypnotic. The cabin was quiet, peaceful. Then Laura sighed softly, a long exhale full of exhaustion she hadn't meant to let slip. Before she could school her expression, Milo lifted his head. His ears perked, and then came a sound she hadn't heard before, a low melodic trill that rose slowly, wrapped in warmth and tenderness, falling off at the end like a comforting sigh. It was gentle. It was deliberate. It was unmistakably empathetic. Laura turned toward him, her heart tightening. "Are you responding to me?" Milo blinked once, twice, then repeated the sound, slower this time, softer, like a question. Kyle, standing by the wood stove tossing in a log, froze with one hand inside the stove. "Okay, that wasn't random. That wasn't even close to random." "He's reacting to breath patterns," Laura said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Animals can—" But Milo interrupted with a tiny murph, as if discouraging her from rationalizing it. Sophia edged closer to the enclosure. "He's comforting you." "That's not—" Laura started. Milo let out a third trill, the softest yet, pressing his cheek to the mesh. Laura's breath caught, because deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't an animal mimicking an owner. This wasn't a pet seeking attention. This was something born of trauma, adaptation, and the strange resiliency that allowed Milo to survive what the other kittens hadn't. He had learned to communicate the only way he could. He had learned to respond to human sorrow because he had been surrounded by it. And now he was offering comfort to the one person he trusted most. That night, after the clinic lights dimmed and the mountains grew quiet again, Laura sat beside the enclosure while Milo sprawled out with his head near the mesh. She spoke in a low voice, telling him about her move from Boston, about the years of emergency calls and late nights, about the exhaustion that drove her to this cabin in search of peace. Milo listened, truly listened, his eyes never leaving her face. When she paused, he let out a tiny chirp, gentle, encouraging, then a little gurgle purr, then the soft trill she now recognized as "I hear you." Laura felt something inside her shift, something that loosened and warmed like thawing ice. She whispered, "You're not supposed to be like this." Milo hummed, "And I'm not supposed to get attached this fast." He chirped twice, tilting his head. Laura smiled weakly. "Yeah, I know. Too late." Milo responded with a soft, triumphant-sounding "murp," as if declaring victory. In that moment, she knew the truth she'd been avoiding. This wasn't just a bond forming. This was a bridge being built. And Milo wasn't simply adapting to her, he was shaping her world too. One sound at a time. By the end of the first full week, Milo had made it abundantly clear that he wasn't content to be just another patient in recovery. No, he wanted to be the center of the entire operation, and he pursued that goal with the determination of a creature who believed the universe itself revolved around him. His antics began early one morning, just as Laura stepped into the clinic carrying her first cup of coffee. The moment the door creaked open, Milo shot upright from his blanket as though fired from a slingshot. He pressed to the mesh, tail flicking excitedly, and delivered an enthusiastic "woo woo woo" that echoed through the room like he was announcing her arrival to an invisible audience. "You're up early," she murmured. Milo responded by sticking one paw through the bars and tapping her boot twice, then letting out a sharp chirp that sounded suspiciously like, "Coffee? Really? You bring that before breakfast for me?" Sophia, who had arrived minutes earlier and was sorting supplies, burst into a quiet laugh. "He's judging your morning priorities." "He judges everything," Laura said. But the judging was only the beginning. As Laura bent to pick up his food tray, Milo spotted the laces on her boots. His eyes widened, pupils dilating in the unmistakable expression of a predator who had found his prey. "Oh no," Laura whispered. "Don't you even—" Milo pounced, not at her leg, not at her ankle, at the shoelace. His paws wrapped around it like a toddler trying to pull a stubborn balloon string. Then he leaned back with all his tiny weight, chirping in heated triumph as the bow came undone. "Milo!" Laura exclaimed, nearly spilling her coffee. Kyle, walking in at that exact moment, stared and then doubled over, laughing. "He mugged your shoes." The bobcat sat proudly, one paw on the lace, delivering a smug brr-erp that made Sophia shake her head. But the shoelace attack was only the first performance of the day. Later, when Laura wheeled in a bin of clean towels, Milo decided the bin was the greatest invention he had ever witnessed. He jumped, clung to the side mesh, hauled himself up like a squirrel climbing a feeder, and launched his entire body into the towels, vanishing inside them in a puff of white fluff. "Milo?" Laura asked carefully. Silence. Suspicious silence. Then a rustle. A shift. A tiny chirp. A towel flipped out of the bin like a white flag in a tiny revolt. Then another. Then Milo popped up, sitting atop the pile like a king on his throne, chest puffed and eyes gleaming. Kyle clapped. "Ladies and gentlemen, the towel monster has arrived." Milo meeped a proud acknowledgement. But perhaps the most unforgettable moment came during one of Laura's educational live streams. She'd begun hosting them weekly to teach people about wildlife care, what to do, what not to do, how to respect animals. That day, the topic was rehabilitating orphaned wildlife, and she had barely introduced herself when a blur of tawny fur launched onto the mid-level perch in the background. "Milo," she whispered sharply, trying not to break eye contact with the camera. Milo ignored her. He positioned himself front and center, sitting perfectly upright with regal composure, for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened his mouth and let out a long, theatrical woo that crescendoed like an opera singer hitting a high note. Laura closed her eyes, defeated. Comments began pouring into the live stream. "Is that a bobcat singing? Ma'am, he stole the show. Please let him co-host." That woo was a spiritual experience. Sophia was behind the camera, shaking silently with laughter. "He wants screen time." "He needs to not," Laura hissed. But Milo, emboldened, hopped down, strutted to the mesh, and delivered a string of chirps and trills as though hosting a press conference. "Okay," Laura said into the camera, trying not to smile. "That concludes today's lesson on why wild animals should not be kept as pets." As the stream ended, Milo wandered off, satisfied with his performance. Sophia wheezed with laughter. "He really thinks he's famous." "Well," Kyle said, checking his phone, "judging by the comments, he is." And Milo wasn't done. Not even close. One afternoon, Laura introduced a puzzle feeder, an old plastic container with holes drilled into the sides. Inside was a small piece of venison. The goal was for Milo to bat and roll the feeder until the treat fell out. A simple enrichment exercise, something to stimulate him mentally. Except Milo didn't want to play by the rules. He batted the feeder once, sniffed it, batted it again. Then he sat down, glared at it, and let out an annoyed tut-tut-tut noise as though scolding it for not cooperating. "Buddy," Laura said, "you have to work for it." Milo chirped sharply. Then, with one smooth, surprisingly clever movement, he shoved the feeder against the mesh, reached through the bars with his paw, and scooped the meat out from the side, bypassing the actual puzzle completely. Sophia gasped, delighted. "He cheated!" Kyle nodded proudly. He outsmarted the toy. Milo strutted away with his prize, tossing a victory trill behind him like confetti. But not all his antics were mischievous. Some were just genuinely funny. One evening, as Laura refilled his water pan, Milo reached forward and tapped the cascading stream with his paw, then looked up at her with a chirp that clearly meant, again. She turned the stream on again. He tapped it. Chirp. She turned it off. He chirped louder. "This is becoming a game, isn't it?" she said. Chirp, tap, chirp, splash. Laura ended up soaked, Milo delighted, and the whole scene reduced Sophia to tears of laughter. Something changed in the Hanzo clinic during those days. Milo's presence didn't just fill the quiet. It softened it, brightened it. The cabin felt warmer. The long days felt lighter. And every sound that came from him, every chirp, trill, meep, or dramatic groan, wove itself into a rhythm that made the place feel alive in a way Laura hadn't expected. Sometimes healing didn't come from solemn silence or deep reflection. Sometimes it walked on 4 paws, trilled at sunrise, and orchestrated chaos with a mischievous tilt of the head. And Milo, without realizing it, or perhaps realizing it entirely, was giving Laura something she hadn't felt in years. A reason to laugh. A reason to look forward to the next morning. A reminder that even in the aftermath of trauma, something small and wild could bring joy back into the world, one ridiculous antic at a time. But joy, no matter how bright, never erased the weight of responsibility that came with Milo. And on the night the storm rolled into the valley, Laura felt that weight settle deeper than ever before. The rain began as a soft patter on the cabin roof, the kind that usually lulled her into a sense of calm. But by nightfall, the sky split open with a crack of thunder that shook the window panes. The power flickered once, twice, then cut out entirely, leaving the clinic in a dim wash of gray from the last shreds of daylight. The wood stove still burned low, casting a faint glow, but the rest of the room sank into a thick, shadowed quiet. Laura grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The narrow beam sliced across shelves, cabinets, and supply crates before landing on the recovery room door. She heard nothing inside. No chirps, no trills, no spirited commentary. That silence, so uncharacteristic for Milo, made something tighten in her chest. She pushed open the door, letting the light sweep across the enclosure. At first she didn't see him. The blankets lay rumpled. The toys were scattered. The water bowl was half-tipped, a thin puddle beneath it glistening under the flashlight. Then, from the far corner of the enclosure, she caught the faint glimmer of two amber eyes watching her from the shadows. "Milo?" she whispered. A tiny sound answered, a low, soft that vibrated like a trembling hum, not playful, not demanding, something gentler, almost cautious. Laura crouched down, holding the flashlight steady. "Hey, buddy. You okay?" Milo stepped forward into the beam of light, his fur slightly puffed from static and nerves. He blinked up at her, then let out a fragile, rising trill that seemed to quiver at the edges. The storm outside cracked again, rumbling through the mountains, and Milo startled, just slightly, before regaining his posture and letting out another trill, this one even softer. "Oh," Laura breathed, the realization sinking in. "You're scared." Not panicked, not frantic, just unsettled, uncertain. She had seen this look in countless animals over the years, creatures who had never known thunder echoing through a metal roof, who didn't understand why the world seemed to rattle. But with Milo, there was something different in the way he responded. He didn't pace or growl. He didn't retreat deeper into the enclosure. Instead, he moved toward her. He pressed his nose to the mesh near her knee and released a soft hum, barely audible, almost like a whispered plea. Sophia appeared behind her with a lantern, illuminating the room in a warm glow. "It's really coming down out there. The whole ridge is out of power." She lowered the lantern toward the enclosure and gasped softly. "Oh, he's scared, isn't he?" "Just a bit," Laura murmured. "It's a lot for him. New sounds, new dark, nothing familiar." Thunder cracked again, louder this time. Milo's ears twitched, and he leaned harder against the mesh, letting out a trembling trill woo that made both women still. Sophia stepped closer. "Is he asking to be near you?" "That's not what he's doing," Laura said quietly, but the look Milo gave her said otherwise. He lifted one paw and pressed it flat against the mesh, slowly, deliberately, not batting, not grabbing, just holding it there like a small hand reaching out. Sophia whispered, "He wants comfort." Laura swallowed, feeling the tightness in her chest deepen. "He needs stability," she corrected gently. "A sense of safety." Milo hummed again, a soft, rhythmic vibration that reminded her of the way a frightened child might hum to keep fear at bay. She set the flashlight down, lifted the latch, and stepped into the enclosure. Milo's entire body relaxed, shoulders dropping, tail settling low, but no longer tense. He approached her, not boldly this time, not with swagger or mischief, but with a quiet, cautious hope. He brushed his cheek against her ankle, then sat down beside her boot and let out a barely there chirp, one that softened into a low trill vibrating with warmth. "You're okay," she murmured. "It's just a storm." But the truth was, the storm outside wasn't the only one he was navigating. She lowered herself onto the small wooden stool inside the enclosure. Milo crawled closer, curling loosely, not touching her outright, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her jeans. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The storm rumbled, the lantern flickered, and Milo, usually bursting with noise and commentary, remained quiet except for the soft, steady trill that matched the slow rhythm of her breath. Kyle soon joined them with extra blankets in hand. "Power's out across the valley," he said softly. Might be a couple hours before we get it back. Laura nodded. We'll be fine here. Kyle stepped closer, his eyes softening when he saw Milo leaning against her leg. Well, will you look at that? He whispered. He's not scared of the noise. He's scared of losing sight of you. It's not fear, Laura said automatically. Kyle raised a brow. Then what is it? She didn't answer, mainly because she couldn't. The truth pressed too close to the surface. Milo wasn't forming dependency. He was forming connection. A bond created not by domestication, but by the strange conditions of his early life. He was seeking out the one thing that had remained steady since his rescue, Laura's presence. Outside, the rain intensified, slapping against the windows in heavy sheets. The roof groaned under the weight of the downpour. Milo stiffened at the sound, but the moment Laura placed a gentle hand on his back, he melted back into stillness. His tail curled around her boot. He released one final trill, a soft, delicate sound that felt like trust laid bare. Sophia whispered, "He's comforting himself by being near you." "And maybe," Kyle added quietly, "comforting you a little too." Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Milo's presence, small, warm, steady, felt like a kind of grounding she hadn't expected. After years of chaos in emergency clinics, years of noise and grief and pressure, this simple moment, sitting in the half-dark with a frightened bobcat, felt strangely healing. The storm continued outside, roaring against the mountains. But inside the enclosure, everything softened. Milo's sounds grew quieter, slower, until eventually, his head lowered to rest against the edge of her boot. His eyes fluttered shut, and a faint, peaceful hum drifted through the dim light. Laura brushed his fur gently. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're safe now." For the first time in a long time, she felt safe, too. Not because the storm had subsided, it hadn't. Not because her worries had been resolved, they hadn't. But because something small and wild had chosen her as his, calm in the chaos. And she realized that maybe, just maybe, he was becoming hers as well. The next morning carried a rare quiet after the storm, the kind of gentle stillness that settles over the mountains when the clouds finally drift away. Laura stepped out onto the porch with a thermos of coffee, breathing in the smell of wet earth and pine. Inside the clinic, Milo had already started his morning chorus. Soft trills, sharp chirps, a rolling hum that rose and fell in playful waves. The rhythm of a new day. She expected nothing more than a routine morning. Feed Milo, check his hydration, refresh bedding, maybe laugh at whatever mischief he had planned before noon. What she did not expect, what she could never have anticipated, was the sound of tires crunching over her gravel driveway. She straightened, squinting toward the access road. A white SUV turned the corner, sunlight catching the state seal stamped across its door. Her heartbeat stalled. Not this early. Not today. Not without warning. The SUV rolled to a stop beside the cabin. The door swung open, and out stepped Officer Naomi Clark. Tall, clipped in her movements, her uniform perfectly pressed despite the damp air. Naomi was known across the region for two things: her strict adherence to wildlife regulations and her ability to make seasoned rehabilitators nervous with a single raised eyebrow. "Morning, Dr. Bennett," she said, voice brisk. "Officer Clark?" Laura answered, summoning calm. "I wasn't expecting an inspection." "That's the point of an unannounced one." Naomi offered a thin, professional smile. "We've had an uptick in reports of illegally kept wildlife in the county. State policy requires a check-in on all permitted facilities." Behind her, Milo let out a high-pitched "woo" from inside the clinic, as if greeting the newcomer. Naomi blinked. "Was that?" Laura forced a steady breath. That's Milo. Ah. Naomi made a note on her clipboard. Let's begin then. Inside, Milo was perched halfway up the side of his enclosure, peering out like a curious child watching the mailman. When Naomi approached the mesh, the bobcat sat tall, ears pricked forward, studying her with shameless intensity. Well, Naomi said, lowering her clipboard slightly. He certainly isn't shy. He's vocal, Laura said carefully. Milo chirped, as if offering confirmation. Then, as Naomi stepped a bit closer, he unleashed a string of melodic trills, almost musical in cadence, rising and rolling like he was performing for an audience. Naomi frowned. That's unusual. He's an expressive animal, Laura replied, part of his imprinting. Naomi jotted another note. Imprinting that extensive can make an animal non-releasable. We're aware, Laura said gently. Milo leaned closer to the mesh, tilting his tongue, head in the most endearing way possible. He let out a soft woo-oo that had the distinct tone of a polite introduction. Naomi paused mid-sentence, almost startled. Is he greeting me? Possibly, Laura said, though her shoulders tightened. Milo's friendliness was only cute if it didn't jeopardize his future here. Naomi lowered into a crouch, studying him with a critical eye. He's awfully calm for a bobcat. No signs of fear. He reacts appropriately to new objects, Laura said quickly, and he still has natural defensive responses. She prayed Milo wouldn't choose this moment to disprove her. Milo blinked slowly at Naomi. Then, with perfect comedic timing, he leaned forward, sniffed her boot through the mesh, and let out the gentlest little woo. Naomi froze. Oh no, Kyle whispered from behind Laura. She hadn't even heard him come in. Sophia was standing beside him, hands clasped, eyes wide. Naomi straightened. Excessive human comfort can be grounds for transfer to a specialized facility. Before any of them could respond, a thunderous crack of distant lightning carried across the ridge. Not enough to shake the cabin, but enough to jolt Milo. His ears flattened, his tail puffed, and he jumped backward with a startled hiss. Naomi blinked, stunned. Milo hissed again, tiny but fierce, before darting to the corner perch, staring at her with full offended indignation. Kyle exhaled loudly. There he is. That's the wild part. Sophia whispered, Thank goodness. Milo continued to glare at Naomi with narrowed eyes, punctuating his displeasure with a tiny tsh noise that was half hiss, half grumble. Naomi raised a brow. Well, that is more appropriate for his species. He's selective, Laura said. He shows comfort only with familiar individuals. Milo hissed again for emphasis. Naomi closed her clipboard and nodded. Noted. The inspection continued. Habitat condition, diet, enrichment rotation, safety protocols. Laura answered every question steadily, but she felt the tension coiled in her spine like a drawn wire. Milo watched each moment with intense focus, occasionally chiming in with chirps or trills whenever Naomi pointed at something. At one point, when Naomi inspected the puzzle feeders, Milo hopped down and swatted one with enough force to spin it across the floor. Then he let out a smug burp, as if demonstrating his athletic abilities. He's certainly energetic, Naomi murmured. He gets plenty of enrichment, Laura assured. When the final checklist item was reviewed, Naomi closed her binder with a quiet snap. Everything appears compliant, Dr. Bennett. Laura let out a breath she'd been holding for nearly an hour. Milo, sensing the shift, delivered a single celebratory chirp from his perch. Naomi allowed the smallest smile. He is charming in his own way. Then, turning serious, again, she added, given his imprinting level and behavioral patterns, you should prepare for the likelihood that he will remain non-releasable. but as long as your facility continues meeting standards, he may stay under your care." Relief washed through the room so strongly that Laura nearly had to steady herself. "Thank you, Officer Clark." Naomi nodded once and stepped toward the door. Just before leaving, she glanced back at Milo. "And you," she said, "try not to give this woman a heart attack." Milo chirped brightly, then turned around and, with perfect comedic timing, delivered a final disdainful hiss at her boots. Kyle slapped his knee. "That cat knows exactly what he's doing." Sophia giggled. "He passed the inspection and insulted the inspector." "Iconic?" Laura leaned her forehead against the mesh for a brief moment, grateful tears prickling behind her eyes. Milo nuzzled the mesh near her cheek and released one soft, content trill. He had no idea what he had just been spared, but he understood one thing perfectly. He was still home. The moment Officer Clark's SUV disappeared down the winding mountain road, the whole world seemed to exhale. The forest settled. The air loosened. Even the lake, still rimmed with storm water from the night before, seemed to quiet its gentle waves. Inside the clinic, Milo sat tall on his perch, surveying the room with the regal satisfaction of someone who had just conquered an empire. Laura leaned against the counter, letting her shoulders sag as all the adrenaline she'd held in finally drained away. Kyle rubbed the back of his neck and shook his head with an exhausted grin, while Sophia slumped into a rolling chair, as if her legs had given out from relief. "Well," Kyle said, "I'd say he handled that better than any of us." Sophia pointed a shaky finger at Milo, especially the part where he hissed at her shoes. "I thought I was going to faint." Milo chirped proudly, arching his back in a slow stretch as though accepting applause after a grand performance. But Laura wasn't laughing yet. The inspector's final words echoed too clearly in her ears. "Prepare for the likelihood that he will remain non-releasable." Non-releasable. A lifetime of human care. A lifetime under her roof. A lifetime depending on her. She looked at Milo, at his bright eyes, his confident posture, the small but fierce way he owned every inch of the room. And she realized she wasn't afraid of the responsibility. Not really. She was afraid of how easily she had already accepted it in her heart. Kyle cleared his throat. "So, what now?" Laura took a slow breath. "Now," she said, "we start planning for his future here. A real future." Sophia sat up straighter. "You mean, you're filing for the permanent care permit?" Laura's voice softened. "I am." Milo perked up at her tone, letting out a questioning, "Woo." She walked to the mesh, knelt down, and met his eyes. "Yeah, buddy," she whispered. "Looks like you're staying." He didn't understand the words, but he felt the warmth. Milo pressed his forehead gently to the mesh and released a long, relieved trill. His world wasn't shifting again. He wasn't being moved somewhere new. He wasn't losing the voices, the smells, the routines he had stitched himself into. He was safe. Kyle clapped his hands. "All right then. If we're doing this, we've got work to do. That enclosure is fine for recovery, but not for a forever home." "We'll expand outward," Sophia said quickly. "A climbing platform on the south side, and a shaded den area, a water feature," Kyle added. "Nothing deep, just a place he can splash in." Laura felt her throat tighten. She'd spent so much time worrying about his past, and his injuries, and his imprinting, that she hadn't allowed herself to imagine something else. Milo's life could be good. Truly, wholly good. "Let's design his habitat," she said. For the rest of the morning, the three of them walked the property with notepads, measuring tape, and a growing sense of excitement. Kyle sketched out climbing logs and platform angles. Sophia drew mock-ups of enrichment walls filled with puzzle feeders and scent boxes. Laura pointed out areas where Milo already liked to watch the lake through the trees and suggested building a viewing perch there. Every time they passed the clinic, Milo would chirp at them, as if supervising the project. He paced the mesh, ears swiveling, clearly invested in the idea that something important was unfolding. By afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds entirely, glinting off puddles and warming the earth. Laura stood alone beside the enclosure, imagining it expanded, imagining Milo racing along new platforms, exploring scents carried by the mountain wind, prowling through patches of sunlight the same way wild bobcats did in the forest. She heard his familiar pattering paws as he approached the gate. He sat, tail curved neatly around his paws, watching her with an expression she had come to understand well: curiosity, comfort, and just a hint of impatience. Laura crouched down, her hand brushing the mesh. "You know," she murmured, "when Kyle brought you here, I thought it would be temporary. I thought you'd heal and go back to the forest. That was the plan." Milo let out a soft murp, as if prompting her to continue. "But the forest didn't give you a fair start," she said. "People took too much from you too early. And now you need a different kind of wild." He blinked, slow and steady, then leaned his cheek against the mesh. A simple gesture, a quiet acceptance, a promise. Late that evening, as shadows stretched across the mountains, the three of them gathered one more time with their sketches and measurements spread across the table. The new enclosure would take weeks to build, but for the first time since Milo arrived, Laura felt a sense of certainty. This wasn't surrender. This wasn't giving up on his wildness. This was honoring it, within the life he could still safely have. When Kyle headed home and Sophia closed the clinic for the night, Laura lingered a while longer on the porch. Fireflies blinked in the growing dusk. A soft breeze carried the smell of damp leaves and distant honeysuckle. She heard Milo settle into his bedding inside the enclosure, the faint rustle of straw and the low hum he made when he was half asleep. As she listened, she realized something new. This wasn't just his home. It had become hers, too. She stood, unable to stop herself from walking over to him one last time. Through the mesh, Milo lifted his head and chirped, a tiny greeting, as if he had been waiting for her. Laura smiled through the soft glow of the porch light. "Good night, Milo," she whispered. He stretched, curled into himself, and answered with a quiet, satisfied trill. A future had been decided today, a life reshaped, not just his, but hers as well. And when she finally turned to go inside, he let out one last chirp behind her, a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Not in the mountains, not in her work, not in her life. She had chosen him. But in so many ways, he had chosen her first. Days after the inspection passed and the paperwork for Milo's permanent care was submitted, the mountain settled into a peaceful rhythm again. The kind of late spring calm that wrapped itself around the property like a warm blanket. The lake shimmered under long afternoons of sunlight. The woods hummed with new leaves and soft breezes, and the clinic felt lighter, almost celebratory. Milo, of course, took full advantage of the newfound peace. He strutted through his enclosure with a confidence he seemed to have earned overnight. He practiced climbing the temporary structures Kyle had rigged up. He ambushed shadows that dared pass his corner of the room. He chirped at squirrels through the window and trilled at Laura every time she opened a drawer. But what changed most was Laura. Where once she worried about how long Milo would stay, she now found herself planning months ahead, enrichment schedules, habitat designs, new feeding routines, even little reminders for what kinds of toys Milo preferred. She had stopped preparing for goodbye. She had finally allowed herself to imagine a forever. One afternoon, as golden light spilled across the clinic floor, Sophia suggested they record a short update video for the center's supporters. "Just something simple," she said, adjusting the small tripod. People love Milo's progress, and now that he's officially staying, we should share the news. Laura hesitated at first. She was tired, more emotionally drained than she wanted to admit. Between the inspection, the decisions, the planning, and the quiet fear she'd been carrying, she hadn't felt ready to sit in front of a camera. But Sophia was right. People had followed Milo's journey since the day he chirped in that rusted crate. They deserved to know. "Okay," Laura said finally. "Let's do it." Sophia positioned the camera so the enclosure was visible behind her. Kyle stepped in later to adjust the lighting with a flashlight he held like a stagehand working a backwoods production. When everything was ready, Laura sat on the stool, smoothed her shirt, and took a long breath. "Rolling," Sophia said softly. Laura began talking, explaining Milo's progress, his imprinting, the results of the inspection, the decision to keep him permanently. Her voice stayed steady, but fatigue clung to her words. She had carried so much responsibility these past weeks, and the weight of it lingered in her shoulders. Behind her, Milo stirred. He had been lounging lazily on a mid-level platform, half asleep in the sun. But as soon as Laura's voice wavered, barely noticeable to anyone else, he lifted his head. His ears pricked, his eyes opened wide, and he climbed down with slow, deliberate curiosity. Laura kept speaking, unaware he was approaching. "And I just want to thank everyone for supporting his recovery. It's been..." Her breath hitched. Just a little. Just enough. Before she could continue, Milo reached the mesh closest to her, pressed his front paws against it, and made a sound no one in the room had ever heard before. A long, wobbling, melodic trill that rose at the end like a question wrapped inside comfort. "Milo?" Laura turned, startled. Milo answered immediately with a soft, "Woo-woo-woo." Trill. The sound stretched and rolled, more expressive than anything he had ever done. Sophia gasped. "Oh my gosh! He's talking to you!" Kyle froze mid-step, flashlight still in hand. "Laura, keep going, don't stop recording." But Laura wasn't thinking about the camera anymore. She was thinking about the tiny bobcat, with his paws pressed to the mesh, tilting his head at her with genuine concern. He chirped again, a rapid series of soft syllables that matched the exact moment her voice had trembled. He wasn't performing. He wasn't begging. He was responding. "Milo, I'm okay," she whispered, voice thickening as tears gathered. Milo seemed unconvinced. He pressed harder, leaning his cheek against the mesh, releasing a soft murr-woo. A question, a reassurance, a plea. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but she knew exactly what it felt like. She scooted her stool closer until her forehead gently touched the mesh. Milo trilled again, quieter now, as if offering the last note of a lullaby. Sophia sniffed behind the camera. "I'm putting this part in the video. People need to see this." Kyle wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. I don't even have words." But the moment wasn't over. Milo stepped back just far enough to tilt his head in the way he did before his most dramatic vocalizations. He inhaled sharply, puffed his cheeks slightly, and let out a perfect, echoing, rhythmic woo-woo-woo. A sweet-talk serenade. Laura burst into laughter, the kind that comes straight from relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming affection all tangled together. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "Oh, Milo," she whispered, "you ridiculous, wonderful boy." The camera caught it all, her tears, her laughter, his trills, his perfectly timed little chirps, a conversation without a single human word exchanged. Later that evening, after they uploaded the clip, nobody expected what would happen next. Within 20 minutes, the comments started. Within an hour, the video hit 100,000 views. By morning, it had crossed 1 million. People from all over the country and beyond began stitching the clip, imitating Milo's sweet talk sounds, captioning it with things like, "When your cat tries to comfort you, but you're the problem," or "This bobcat speaks better emotional support than my husband." But most comments were simple and heartfelt. "I didn't know a wild animal could express something so gentle. This made my whole week. That bobcat understands love." Laura watched the numbers rise with a dazed smile. She wasn't someone who chased virality. She didn't care about fame or algorithms or trending sounds. But something about this moment felt different. This wasn't a meme. This wasn't a joke. This was a reminder the world seemed desperate for. Connection can happen anywhere, even between species who weren't supposed to speak the same language. Late that night, long after the notifications had slowed and the clinic lights were dim, Laura walked to the enclosure one more time. Milo lifted his head, his eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. "Hey, sweetheart," she murmured. He chirped, soft and warm. She pressed her palm to the mesh. "Thank you." Milo leaned into the touch and gave one last trill, gentle, lingering, a sound that circled her heart and settled there. The sweet talk that had changed everything. The next evening arrived soft and golden, the kind of quiet, early summer dusk that made the Blue Ridge Mountains glow as if the day's last light had been poured gently over the ridgelines. The lake reflected streaks of rose and copper across its still surface, and a warm hush drifted over the property. Even the birds seemed to lower their voices, as though granting the world a moment of peace. Laura stepped out onto the porch with a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. The past days had been a whirlwind. Interviews, messages, news outlets wanting to feature Milo's video, and hundreds of emails from people moved by that strange, tender sound he'd made. It was overwhelming, and yet strangely grounding. She wasn't famous. She wasn't trying to be. But Milo had given people something they didn't know they needed. Hope. A little laughter. A reminder that gentleness still had a place in the world. Now, as the evening cooled and the breeze brushed softly across her shoulders, she let all the noise fall away. Just her, the mountains, and the bobcat who had turned her life upside down. Milo lay near the front corner of his new enclosure, stretched out on fresh straw, his eyes half closed in that dreamy way he reserved for moments he felt safest. His coat glowed warm under the fading light. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't chirp, didn't trill. He simply existed, quiet and present, breathing slow and deep. And somehow, that silence spoke more than his sweetest sounds. Laura walked down the path and stopped beside the enclosure. Milo opened one eye, blinked sleepily, and let out the softest, most contented little chirp she had ever heard, like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, emotional week. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "Rough day of being famous?" Milo yawned, a wide, dramatic stretch that pushed his paws through the mesh until they brushed the dirt. Another trill followed, a low one, rolling out like a quiet rumble of affection. He wasn't talking tonight. He was simply sharing space. Laura leaned her arms on her knees, sipping her tea. For a while, neither of them moved. The mountains turned from gold to purple. Fireflies began to rise from the long grasses. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called once, twice, then fell silent again. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath with them. She glanced at Milo, remembering the scrawny, angry-eyed kitten in that rusted crate, the chirps that had first startled her in the morning fog, the defiance, the stubbornness, the ridiculous antics, the way he had demanded, loudly, constantly, unapologetically, that someone finally listened to him. And she had. Listening to him had changed everything. You know, she murmured softly, I thought I came here to help animals heal, but you, she exhaled, shaking her head at the truth she'd been circling for weeks. You healed something in me too. Milo lifted his head at her tone. His ears rotated forward, and he scooted an inch closer to the mesh, offering that same steady gaze he gave her whenever he noticed her mood shifting. A look that said he understood, not the words, but the feeling. She pressed her fingers gently through the mesh. Milo leaned forward, rubbing his cheek along her knuckles, humming softly. A long, warm trill filled the air, not loud, not playful, not one of his dramatic serenades, just present. A sound made for her, and only her. Tears rose unexpectedly behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude so full it felt like her chest might not be big enough to hold it. Thank you, she whispered. The breeze rustled through the tall grass. A willow branch swayed. Milo answered with a final chirp, then settled down again beside her, close enough that she could feel the soft vibration of his breathing through the mesh. For the first time since moving to the mountains, Laura understood what real stillness felt like. Not loneliness, not emptiness, but the peace that comes when life stops taking from you and begins giving back. When the sun finally dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in the last faint blush of color, she drew a slow breath. She thought of the people who had written to her. The widower who said Milo's voice made him smile for the first time in months. The young woman who said the video helped her through a long night shift at the hospital. The retired teacher who wrote, "Animals speak in ways we forget to listen for." This little bobcat, this silly, stubborn, sweet-talking creature, had touched so many lives without even knowing it. Laura looked back at him, curled into a peaceful tuft of fur and whiskers. You did all that, she whispered, just by being yourself. Milo flicked an ear, but didn't open his eyes. The stars began to appear, slowly at first, then in soft clusters across the sky. The lake shimmered back at them, dark and glassy. Laura felt the moment settling inside her, the way certain memories do. The ones you know will stay for the rest of your life. The world would go on being loud, complicated, chaotic. But tonight she had peace. And just before she rose to go inside, Milo breathed out one last tiny, sleepy chirp, like a promise, like a thank you, like the echo of everything they'd rebuilt together. Laura touched the mesh one more time and whispered into the quiet, You're home, Milo, and so am I. The breeze carried her words into the trees, where they mingled with the soft sound of leaves and the steady rhythm of the lake, and the night closed gently around them. A sanctuary built from second chances, from laughter and healing, and from the smallest, sweetest voice that had ever changed a life. If Milo's journey touched your heart, even just a little, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let me know you're here, listening to this story right alongside us. It's an easy way to say, I'm part of this. And if you'd like to follow more stories of hope, rescue, and the unexpected ways animals speak into our lives, make sure to subscribe and stay with this channel. There are many more journeys waiting to be told, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.